When I think of domestic violence, really, I think of violence that occurs in the home among family members. And we do know that there's a problem with violence, family violence, not only in Barbados, but across the world. And when I think of family violence, it's the abuse, spousal abuse, it's the abuse of sibling abuse, child abuse, where, parent-child situations, and of course elder abuse. So it is a domestic violence issue, and it's one of those things that we need to address in our society.
Well, based on my understanding of the definition of domestic violence, is violence in the home by someone resident in your home. So if an elder is being abused in their home or wherever they live by someone from that environment, then it would be a domestic violence issue.
Well, it certainly would start there because it has a lot to do with the relationships within the home. But it is not only that, because beyond that, there are institutions that would be purporting to handle the elderly, in which case it then becomes an institutional issue as opposed to a domestic issue. I think what a lot of people may see is the fact that Junior puts Mummy in a home and Junior doesn't go back. But sometimes he can't. So therefore the home becomes Mummy's new home. And it's no longer then a domestic issue. To me, it's an institutionalized issue that has to be dealt with very differently.
I think it is basically domestic, because when we take our elderlies, for example, to a old person's home and those nursing homes, and they're being cared, I've been there, I've been to a few. It's a very homely type of setup. You know, they're all together like brothers and sisters. They have all the nurses that take care of them. They're very old. Most of them are very old, so they're treated like kids, because we become children again as we get older. So to me, it's a domestic setup. Most of the times they're not in big buildings like hospitals, they are in houses. So the whole setup is very domestic, very homey oriented. So I think if someone is abusing one of these homes, certainly it becomes a domestic issue.
And if I could add to that, because when we think of abuse, it's not an accidental injury thing. There are those intended acts of violence, deliberate, and then of course when it comes to neglect, there are those that are non-intentional, but nonetheless those negligent acts can cause harm, and therefore they're also abusive.
It takes a bit of empathy to understand what it would be like to be in that person's shoes. Sympathy is not it. You have to be empathetic. You have to understand what they are going through and what they're facing. And from experiences which touch pretty close, I would say that to me it would be quite traumatic.
How would it impact anyone? It will be in a negative way. And I'm not a very passive person. I would probably retaliate.
You're accustomed to certain freedoms. You are not a fool, even though you might become slow. So your brain is still functioning at a level that is capable of reasoning. You still have the same personal desires to be fed, to be kept clean, to be loved, especially to be loved. And it would be rather difficult. I don't know that I would be able to live with it for very long as a person.
It would break my heart. We know many elderly people also suffer from dementia, but every human being has feelings, so although they may not be able to articulate and the brain doesn't work the same way, when pain is inflicted on the person, they recoil, and they know that pain is not a healthy thing to have happen to them. So even if an elderly person has, say, dementia, Alzheimer's, and many times those are the people who are abused as well, because they're confused, their thoughts are confused, and people think, oh, nobody will believe her, nobody knows, nobody will think that she's really telling the truth.
In which case you're absolutely helpless, and you won't be able to to say, well, you know, so-and-so is abusing me, somebody just hit me, somebody do something, I'm being hurt, you know. So I would assume that, you know, it would impact me very negatively, whether I can speak for what happened or not, because if I have Alzheimer, that abuse is going to going over my head in a couple of seconds.
And there are also those individuals with that problem, those elderly persons, who become most troublesome as well. And therefore they are at risk. But to put myself in the shoes of an elderly person who's at risk for abuse, I would be fearful. And there are older people who are fearful.
Really and truly, if I were in that situation as an elderly person, and the people who are meant to be taking care of me were treating me poorly, abusing me, is there an agency you can call? Is there, you know, like there are hotlines for abused children or hotlines for abused women? I guess I would have to call one of them and say, listen, I'm being abused too, help me out. But, you know, just like sometimes a child may not be able to articulate what's happening to them, an abused person, if they're suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, may not be able to articulate what's going on in their life and may not be able to tell anybody and cry for help. So it's easy to say what I would do, but sometimes it's not that simple. I would hope that someone around me would know what to do.
Well, on the individual level, there's not a lot that you can do as an individual. It has to be a broader outreach. Become involved with organizations or institutions that offer protection, that offer training, because that is one of the big things. But let me tell you, the caregiver is also as badly injured as the person being cared for. And people don't seem to understand that. And that, I think, is where a lot of the problems are generated. Because you can become extremely exhausted, you can become extremely frustrated, you can become almost a lord, you know, because you now have someone who you are controlling. But they are controlling you, because every whimper, every requirement, and it is fatiguing. It is extremely fatiguing for the caregiver. But a lot of people don't seem to remember that. So I'd say that we need to have some sort of improved communication, education, information dissemination, so that all sectors, the elderly who are victims as well as the victimizers, who are made to understand what the task is, because it's not a small task.
How could you be afraid of reporting something like that? That's the first thing you should do. Report something like that. You know, definitely if you know that one of your loved ones is being abused or used or mistreated by anyone, I don't care who it is, first of all, they will got to deal with me and I might get locked up, and then the authorities will have to deal with you, because it's not something you condone, it's not something that is justifiable. There is no excuse for such behavior. You know, so definitely I will tell them, go to the authorities. First of all, you need to screen where you're taking your people. If you're not going to take care of them yourself at home and you're going to put them in a place, you need to screen these. Like, you're going to go through with a fine-tooth comb and you're going to, you know, make periodic visits, just drop on them like that, because you never know what you can see. That's the only way to know that something wrong is happening, by investigating, monitoring, and checking on staff. Otherwise, you never know. And definitely go to the authorities the minute you suspect, even if you haven't seen, even if you suspect, go and say, look, I think this is happening here because my mom has a bruise, my father has a cut, whatever. Something happened to that person, it has to be reported. Simple. Just go to the authorities. That's my first advice.
I will say to them, they better do it and do it quickly before one day they find that the person is injured in a way that impairs their life. Even if which could make the person more disabled than the person already is, if the person has a disability. The important thing is, if you can remove the person from that setting, you do it. Let's say if you have a grandmother, you're a grandchild, but she's living with another grandchild who is abusing her. There's nothing wrong in saying, I am going to take my grandmother to live with me. and they may want to defy you. But sometimes what some people do not do, they will say, well, you're living in the house, so I'm not taking her out. But you have to be careful as to who you think you're hurting. You're not hurting the able-bodied adult or the younger person, but it's really that older person. So if you feel in your heart that the person is being ill-treated and you can do anything, whether it's removing them yourself from that situation or whether it's reporting it to the authorities, if you're just a neighbor or a friend of the family, you have a legal responsibility to do so. We cannot ignore abuse in our society. We ignore the abuse of children, we ignore abuse, intimate partner violence, we ignore that. We say, oh, let them get on with it. And sometimes we say, well, that's her child, and she's going to let her child treat her like that, or that's their mother, I'm not interested. That's, we're turning a blind eye. And that happens a lot. We often say, oh, they would handle that. And or sometimes you have some people who know it's happening, and then they say, that's none of my business. She's too miserable anyhow, so maybe she's getting what she deserves. But we always have to remember, abuse, whether it is physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, whatever, neglect, that we have to intervene and do something about it. Again, what I want to reiterate is the fact that there are some vulnerable groups in our society, and the elderly as a group falls into the category of vulnerable.
Reporting means embarrassment. Reporting means the possible following of the press and turning it into a media show, which the victim doesn't wish, because it's further eroding that individual, and the person who is the caregiver or the parent or the relative doesn't want it either, because it puts them in a bad light. It makes it seem as though they're uncaring, devilish. So it is rather difficult, unless you have a version of Crime Stoppers where you can anonymously bring the attention of the agencies responsible to the problem, then it may go unreported for those simple reasons of self-protection.
I'll report it for them. I guess, why is that person afraid to report it? Is the abuser someone that they themselves depend on? Are they afraid that the person will turn on them? If they're afraid to report it, maybe I can report it for them. But then there's a question, it's a real question. When you report it, then what? Will that make the situation better or worse? And that's a real question in a lot of people's minds. Are the authorities going to be responsive? When they respond, are they just going to come and peek, say what's going on here, and then leave the abuser and the abused in the situation for the abuser now to take out their frustration, their anger at being told upon on the abused person? So it's a hard question. I guess I would have to be clearer onto what the situation is in Barbados in terms of who I report to and how effective they are when these things are reported, and then what is the situation of the person involved. It's delicate.
This is an EU-funded project.